I'd say like the um, Victorian times when um, it was presenting a different image of Britain, um, I think, than what we're used to or what I'm used to. I'm UK dual national, so I kind of grew up with a different the post-colonial UK. It almost seemed like a return to that, where all the pageantry, the everything was at the nth degree. No, nothing was left undone. Um, I think that's kind of what really made it so significant was how large, just the scope, the parade, everything was big. Um,
Yeah. Accurate. Um, Having spent a significant amount of time, and we will, yeah, and maybe Reese, you can help us with this as well if you would like. I have on our first slide here, we'll talk about the difference between the United Kingdom, the British Isles, the country, just for something that not everyone maybe is familiar with, as you and I would be. But having grown up there, having family from there, I'm sure if you have noticed that there are certain words that I say or spell in a weird way. Yes, like you experience this, and you experience the monarchy in a very specific way for most of your life. And then something that Reese points out, and something that I experienced as well, is that suddenly the monarchy is completely different. It's portrayed in a completely different light. I think Reese is pointing out that it felt very old-fashioned. It went back to that sort of imperialistic type of feel. It is as much a military show as it was a funerary procession. You have, all sorts of people in very fancy dress regalia, regardless of whether they have or have not ever served in battle, or if they inherited a title from their family. It's an immense pageant, in a way that felt very, I don't want to say the entire thing felt disingenuous, but in a way, there was an aspect of that, the way we've seen the monarchy evolve, the way we've seen the monarchy evolve over the past 7-8 decades, didn't lead to this, right? It's been evolving away from this for so long that to see it go back to this was kind of an interesting juxtaposition. Anyone who may not have, anyone who maybe hasn't ever been to England, who didn't have a lot of previous experience with the Queen, with the monarchy, want to give a different perspective, because I think Reese gives a very good perspective of like familiarity with this. If you are maybe unfamiliar with the British monarchy, what, did you see things differently? Did you see this as what you expected of the Queen's funerary procession? Maybe something to that extent.
I mean, can you guys hear me okay? I'm using a microphone now.
Yeah, there you go.
I think being an American who wasn't super obsessed with British culture, it was really interesting to see how many Americans were affected by the Queen's death when it's a completely different country and has no really hold on us as other than like culturally. Obviously, elephant in the room, the guy who rushed the casket, I read a bunch about that because everybody was talking about that guy.
Yep.
But also it reminded me of the royal wedding, honestly, when everyone was obsessed with the wedding with Meghan and Harry. It kind of just felt like a really big American funeral. I mean, like really strict traditions, and everything felt kind of forced and awkward. I think it was weird that everything was super climactic, but Charles's little note that he put in the wreath was like really abrupt. I don't know, it felt, it wasn't what I expected. I expected it to be large. I didn't expect it to have as big of an effect as it did, really, just because the monarchy doesn't really have a purpose. And now everyone is really anti-monarchy now that the queen's dead. It's almost like now that she's dead, no one wants a monarchy anymore because everyone seems to hate Charles and everyone wants him to step down. So it's, I feel like a lot happened just from this one event, despite the fact that the queen really didn't hold a lot of power. And it's interesting how an event like this can affect a country so politically when it's a figure who held no political standing.
Yeah, excellent perspective as well. Thanks, Ben. Other thoughts, inputs, things that you saw?
Something that interested me was the input of like other world leaders in the funeral. Like President Biden attended, as did Macron, and I'm sure a few others. But how like they weren't given the same priority as like other like royal figures, noble people. Like they were sat a little further back. They didn't have quite the importance of the normal those. But at the same time, like Ben was saying, like the queen didn't hold a lot of political power, right? It's not like it was the passing of some president that all of these figures had been interacting with. It was more a symbolic gesture, and so the fact that it had such a sway on world leaders and other figureheads to like appear, but like not necessarily have that priority was interesting to me as to how the rest of the world kind of interacted with that event, and how the British, or yeah, how the monarchy kind of reacted to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things you pointed out there that I think are important to note. Like you said, in the actual seating plan, there's an extensive hierarchy that still exists and is very strongly enforced, as far as not the royals themselves, but the other areas of monarchic hierarchy. So anyone who holds a title of any kind had seating preference over foreign dignitaries. And you're right, that's not something we often see in these big, things that we typically think of as international events. Someone like the President of the United States tends to be pretty important. Tends to not be someone you would see sitting near the back. I will not, other than slightly jokingly, mention Donald Trump's message about the seating arrangement, but it did not convey, an understanding of that, an understanding of the fact that this was in fact a British funeral that was attended by leaders of state from around the world. And you mentioned, the interaction between these individuals, someone like, someone like Joe Biden has been president for 2 years, right? The Queen has been queen for decades. She's seen presidents come and go and come and go and come and go. And like she's met every president dating back to like Eisenhower at least, FDR, like that's insane in comparison to our relatively fast changing political system. Even as as someone, and we will talk a little bit about how much power the Queen really has, but even as someone who served primarily as a political figurehead, that is, the person coming, the Joe Biden coming to the funeral doesn't have that much experience with the Queen. Other heads of state may, Macron has been around for a while in the political scene, has had more interactions with the Queen than Joe Biden has, and yet still, was seated behind anyone with a British title, because the number of people that are in line for the throne is extensively long, and that takes precedence. So, we see it treated not as an international event, This was not, this was not a United Nations meeting. Being a member of the UN Security Council was not as important as being a member of the British royal family, right, in this funeral. And that is something, again, that's very interesting. That's not something we tend to have a lot of understanding of in the United States, because that's not how we treat our politicians. The funeral for a president is treated as an international event. If they're in office. If they're not in office, it's a little bit less so. It's a little bit smaller scale. If it's the passing of a president after they have served in office. But the death of a president while in office, somewhat comparable to the Queen passing, as she was still the Queen. That is not the same level of event. It's not treated the same way. It's not attended the same way as something like this.
I would disagree a little, and I would say that was an international event because it was a Commonwealth event. You didn't obviously,
True.
the British royal family is the British royal family, but when it comes to world leaders, you had the Governor General of Barbados, Canada, St. Kitts, and I can't pronounce the second island, but all the very small Commonwealth countries, Commonwealth realms, and their prime ministers, governor generals, and the Commonwealth republics, they still took priority behind the British family, but prioritized ahead of other world leaders. And the Commonwealth was incorporated into the funeral to some extent. Like, I think the Mounties led the procession, small stuff like that, but a little bit of a reminder that she was head of the Commonwealth and queen of, I think, throughout her life, she was queen of, I think, 30 countries or something. At the time of her passing, it was still 14.
No, that is a very good point to make, is that, I suppose maybe this was even a mistake of my use of the word international. International being that, traditional, like, United States sits at the head of stuff kind of idea, right? Or even the Security Council in the UN. But you're right, that is not to say that this was not an internationally attended event. And the Commonwealth, which expands even further off of this picture that I have up on our screen share, the Commonwealth, having sort of precedence in that, and having that significance to the funeral events, outweighing something like the United States. Something obviously Vladimir Putin didn't attend, but and actually, yeah, surprisingly few members of the UN Security Council attended once I start thinking about the other countries that sit on it. But, Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron are good examples there of, people that attended, that being, as they are not members of the Commonwealth, their countries are not members of the Commonwealth, do not sit in quite the same esteem as the international members that were, part of the British Empire. So no, that's a very good point to bring up. And I think that does, tie in. I want to mention this map that I have up. Something that I think a lot of students maybe don't always comprehend, but I think it's also a very good expression of where we started talking in this class about the differences between things like countries, nations, and states. Looking at this map, you can see that there are 5 countries included, functional countries, that being Scotland, Wales, England, the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland. Not all entirely recognized by the United Nations. They all hold different positions with the UN, and they can also hold different positions with things like the EU now, especially after the Brexit incident, undoing, whatever you want to call Brexit. It's been a time of turmoil for this, but we have different terminology for each of these different groups. all of the people in the circle, live on the British Isles. That doesn't even include the Commonwealth, which, as Reese mentions, includes at this point just about a dozen, 14 total countries around the world. But even just here on the British Isles, we have a lot of interesting politics going on because of the conflicts between nations and states. The nations being, Scotland having an extremely long history of independent thought from England, and that being represented in these interactions with the British monarchy. That we'll talk about political parties in a minute, but some of the independence parties that exist, the Scottish independence parties are seizing upon this opportunity to try to make a stronger push for Scottish independence. We're actually not seeing that as much from Wales right now, in a counterpoint to that, because Charles served as the Prince of Wales. And interestingly enough, Charles actually made some political inroads in Wales that none of the other members of the British family were ever able to make. And so we're not seeing as strong of a push right now from the Welsh Independence Party. So it's, we're even seeing just these small interactions that are expressing this difference between nations and states, acting out on this international scale in response to one person dying. And that's fascinating, because we don't necessarily always see that, and we don't expect that to be the way that these parties and these countries will interact. Like Ven said, this was maybe not expected, maybe you didn't expect it to be quite as big importance wise. Obviously it's going to be the biggest, most expensive funeral procession in the world, but maybe you didn't expect quite that political reaction to come out of this. And the fact that the mere passing of a monarch will have political ripples for decades to come, even if it does not result in the end of the monarchy, which is something that a lot of people are calling for. Even if it doesn't result in the end of the monarchy, even if the monarchy itself survives, there will still be ripples of this one single event. And the way that Charles now handles, I'm sorry, I should refer to him by title, the now King Charles, the way that King Charles the Third, right? Someone correct me if he's not the third. Okay, thanks. King Charles the Third, the way that he treats the monarchy will truly determine whether the monarchy continues or not. And I say that because Queen Elizabeth ensured the continuity of the monarchy by her own actions. So real quick, how much power does the Queen have? Right, Ven posited that the Queen is a figurehead with no political power in the country, or was in the country. Okay. Can the Queen break laws in England? I'm trying to think of
Probably in
measures.
the same way that like Jeff Bezos break laws.
Okay, so maybe in the same way that Jeff Bezos, just being rich.
Oh, sorry, you're saying?
No, go ahead.
All prosecutions are in her name. The UK prosecutorial agency is the Crown Prosecution Service, Her Majesty's courts. So I think it's kind of like the same way you can't in theory, indict the same, that type of deal where the Crown Prosecution Service would be very reluctant to. And I think royal pardons are still a thing, if not used very often. Interesting hypothetical.
Yeah. And I raised this hypothetical because it is something that has come up here in the United States recently. It used to be, like 5 years ago, it used to be we had to refer back to Nixon. And none of my students had been alive under Nixon, so no one knew what the whole Nixon trial looked like, or would have looked like. But one of Nixon's primary arguments was that a president cannot commit a crime because the president is the head of the executive branch, which is the branch responsible for the enforcement of crime. So if the president does it, it is not illegal. Okay, you can, obviously you can roll your eyes. Like, it never went to trial, and God, I hope it would have failed as an argument, because like that's horrifying. But that same argument started to be raised by some of President Trump's lawyers as he tried to defend himself against the first and second impeachment inquiries. So like, not a dead argument in the United States as to whether the president is even actually capable of committing a crime. That argument is based on the British monarchy, because that question has gone to trial in Britain. And as Rees suggests, the legal system of England is dispensed by Her Royal Majesty, or now, in the case of King Charles III, His Royal Majesty. It is impossible for the monarch to break the law, because the law is at the determination of the monarch. Even to this day, this sounds like something we'd say about, like, the King George V or something, this is something we would say about King Henry VIII, right? That that the law is dispensed by King Henry VIII. So that's why he can, just kind of work his way through wives until he gets what he wants. That mode of it, yes, that norm is extremely outdated. But the fact of law being presented by the Queen and being dispensed by the Queen still stands. The Queen could, the King, I'll try to start saying the King or the monarch. I'm sorry, I'm still emotionally dealing with no longer having the Queen. The King can prosecute anyone in the country of England for anything. They can independently decide what judicial punishment should be exerted on that individual. They can also, by that same logic, give a pardon for any perceived crime committed by any individual in the country. They can seize any ship that sails within British waters unilaterally, without cause, without designation. They can just say that ship is now the Crown's. They don't need a passport. The Queen never had a passport, because who creates passports in the United Kingdom? The Queen, the King, the monarch. It wasn't even until 2003 that Queen Elizabeth officially gave power of the passport creation, officially gave it to an office of the executive branch. It had been done before that, obviously. She wasn't personally signing every passport and handing them out, but it wasn't an official law in the UK until 2003. That was a power that she designated beyond herself. The Queen functionally, legally, had near limitless power. And yet, I'm not saying that, that all of this is not to say that Venn was wrong, because that would be a pretty crummy lecture. And today's lecture is how Venn is wrong. No, I would never do that. But Venn's not wrong. The only reason that the monarchy still exists to this day is that despite having that power, Queen Elizabeth chose not to execute it. Partially by not executing people, right? That's a power that the Queen has. So by choosing not to do that in so many ways, by maintaining the monarchy, knowing that through intense history, right, through world wars, the post-World War period when she became queen, the period of time during which we had the troubles in Ireland, multiple attempts of independence from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland during her tenure, multiple global wars. Everything that England does had to be done at the behest of the Queen. And even attempts to subvert that, an attempt in the late 90s, the Parliament attempted to pass a law that would remove the ability to declare war from just the Queen. Parliament tried to pass an act that said that Parliament could declare war on another country, because that was one of the powers that fell under the monarch. Only the monarch could truly declare war. So Parliament tried to pass a law saying, hey, Parliament should be able to declare war as well. The Queen vetoed it. Queen said no, even after that act passed Parliament. And that power was not given to Parliament. So everything about England was at the decree of the monarch. But the monarchy continued to exist because instead of exerting that power, the Queen was an absolute expert, the best you could ever possibly imagine at balancing having that power, maintaining that power, and not using it beyond anything that would offend anyone in the country. It is incredible. And it is I think the legacy that Queen Elizabeth will always have is that she was able to maintain a monarchy in a time when truly no one else and no other country could have maintained that monarchy. There are still pushes today, and that's why I said that, the actions of King Charles will now determine whether the monarchy persists. Because King Charles, eventually King William, if he chooses to keep that as his regal name, will have to do the same. Will have to spend their time as the monarch ensuring that the crown is a stable foundation on which the rest of the government is built. Because that's truly where the Queen or the King sits in the country. I have here just the very simple flow chart of what things look like in the United States. This should be too familiar. Don't worry about writing, too much of this down, but just understanding some of these interactions. Compare that to where the monarchy sits in the UK system of government. The monarch has say in all of the interactions of government. The monarch could, at any point in time, dissolve Parliament, appoint their own prime minister, and call for a new election of representatives. At any time. But by not doing that, by always having Her Majesty's government determined by Parliament, by almost always approving the Prime Minister that was suggested by Parliament, the Queen managed to maintain the power of the monarch by not using it. It's a very delicate balance, and it has been that way for the Queen's entire tenure. And now that responsibility, beyond even the responsibilities of the crown itself, but that responsibility passes on to Charles, and eventually passes on to the next heir, currently Prince William. So this balance is at the core of understanding British government. The Queen is the monarch is always present, is the foundation upon which all of this is built, which is something that we cannot say about the president in the United States. And everything extends off of that foundation of the monarchy. So even if the monarch does not have functionally any real political power, because of that choice to not exercise the power that they do have, they're doing it to keep it in balance and to maintain this delicate back and forth of why the British government continues to function. Now, to continue in a little bit of a comparative way, I want to look more specifically at Parliament, which I just realized in this chart is spelled wrong. That's awesome. I never realized that that was a T in there. Sorry, that should say Parliament. I'll have to go find a better graphic to use. But the Parliament, in a very familiar sounding way, is split into two houses. You have the lower house and you have the upper house. Now you'll notice by this nice little side-by-side that I made that one of the major differences with British Parliament is that it is proportionally representative. It is a parliament, not a Congress. So the list, and I did in fact update this, so these are all the correct numbers of the current Parliament's representation. The list of the number of political parties that you get is going to be significantly longer because it is not a two-party system. In the United States lower house, which is the House of Representatives, we have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Right now, the Democratic Party has majority. It may maintain that. Current projections are trending in that direction, even though there is still a current likelihood that the Republican Party will take majority or at least get very close to it in this next election cycle. But that has been shifting. Again, we're political scientists. We can never actually predict the future. We can just look at trends and what may or may not happen. But we probably are not going to, I probably will not have to change this list of the political parties with seated representation in the House of Representatives, right? The United Kingdom, on the other hand, has more. And I've roughly ordered them in terms of political leanings, if you will, along a spectrum from conservative to liberal. It's not a perfect spectrum because in any parliamentary system, parties don't line up exactly to a place on a political spectrum. You have some parties that may be single issue parties. You've got a party like the one down at the bottom, the Sinn Féin, which is a Scottish independence party. No, it's a Welsh independence party. Yeah?
Irish.
Irish. Ah, sorry. Plaid Cymru is the Scottish Independence Party, the
Nope.
pure Scottish
Plaid,
Independence Party.
Plaid is Welsh.
Yeah.
Plaid.
Darn it! Why am I forgetting all of these? Thank you, Reese. Okay, so Irish, Welsh, Scottish, they've all got independence parties out there. Alaba, I'm not going to get this one wrong. that one always I like that one because that was the Scottish National Party, and then the dude broke off from it because he was accused of sexual harassment, which he did not get, he was not punished for, but then the Scottish National Party wouldn't accept him back. So he was like, I'll just form my own party. That's something you can do in a parliamentary system that you can't do in a two-party system like the United States. But you get a lot more representation. And I will get them straight as far as, I should have gone back and reviewed which one was from which country that they wanted to be independent. But think about this in terms of what this would look like in the United States. I mean, it's pretty beyond our understanding to sit here and think, oh, well, maybe, what if there were seated representatives who were a member of the Texas Independence Party? Right? It's a political view that's held by members of the Texas legislature, but we don't have representation of a Texas Independence Party in our federal legislature. And that is, I think, something that's very different, but it is also not less stable, right? Looking at this, you may think, how does this ever functionally get a government? Well, the simple answer is that you have to form coalitions among different groups to get a government. So the Conservative Party, the Tories, have 357 members in the lower house. They have to make sure that they have a majority to be able to make any decisions. So they will align themselves with other parties. So, Scottish National Party has some pretty good representation. That might be one you want to go after. If you can't line up on that, because right now they're going pretty hard on the Scotland independence argument, maybe you go after both the DUP, DUP, and the Independent Party. You have to form a coalition to be able to maintain and form the government itself. And so parties are, even though there are many more of them, are much more likely to coordinate and try to get along or try to find that common ground amongst themselves to be able to still form a government in this process. For the sake of comparison, just before we wrap up, also look at the upper house. The upper house in the UK has a very interesting aspect, as the UK does not have the principle of a separation of church and state as we do in the United States. So 24 members of the House of Lords are the Lords Spiritual, and these are members of the Church of England that sit in representation in the upper house. But you'll still see here, pretty significant amount of variation in the number of people that serve in this upper house. So you still have a majority of the Tories. They still constitute Her Majesty's government. I should mention I have the Labour Party here marked as HMMLO. That is Her Majesty's most loyal opposition. So even the opposition party still is in service to Her Majesty, His Majesty. I'll have to change that, dang it. But you see how this difference runs. And in the United States, in the Senate, we actually have a necessity right now for creating something of that same process. The Democrats don't have the true majority of the Senate. Since they have the tie-breaking vote, as long as they can get the independents on board, the Democrats can hold a majority, which is why we say that they currently have the majority, because the two independent votes do tend to caucus with the Democrats. But they don't have a true majority. They have to form the same kind of coalition, which is not all that common. It doesn't happen frequently in the Senate, but it has been happening more frequently over the past few years. We've really been splitting hairs over this representative question of who votes with who and where does that tie-breaking vote go. So it's just a different way of understanding this system and a different form of interaction between these different groups. As long as I can keep straight which group wants independence for who. There's always going to be someone, especially from Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, that is going to represent an independent desire from Great Britain, from the UK, to be their own country, to separate out, and no longer be governed by this very centralized government in London. Whether that will ever be successful just is to be determined. Like I said, some of these voices have grown louder, especially since the passing of the Queen. I'll ask Reese, any thoughts? Anyone gonna become independent? Or at least your family is hoping that they might?
Well, I'm ethnically Welsh.
Okay.
Welsh nationalism, it's not really something that's big. If you ask my family, Scottish nationalism probably has a bit of a shot because the North Sea economy is pretty big. If Scotland gets a chunk of that sweet, sweet oil money, yeah, they'll be set for life and not really dependent on London. Northern Ireland is just that's a mess that will, I think the status quo will remain. I don't see Ireland really wanting, or I should say ERA, because Ireland is also the whole island. I don't see ERA wanting Northern Ireland back because that's just asking for more trouble than they want. One thing I would note on the last slide is Sinn Féin is they are abstention. I'm trying to remember the right word, but yeah, they abstain from Parliament. They don't show up on principle that they don't, or they believe that Parliament doesn't have the right to rule over Northern Ireland, which is something very unique that you don't see in the UK. And also for that same reason, I believe they aren't part of Her Majesty's Most Loyal Opposition or anything like that.
Correct. Yeah, they are abstentionist. They maintain those seats for the sake of being abstentionist. To be able to say that they will not vote in an illegitimate government. Yeah, thank you. A good point to bring up. Again, something you don't get to see in the US too often. So yeah, we'll wrap there. I think a good chance, a few things that we can talk about in the discussion. Please don't make the discussion just about my inability to remember which country, which party wants independent. But I think you'll have a good discussion this week, starting off with looking at a couple of these countries. And we will continue next week on Monday. So thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.